I get it. When you're scrolling through a sea of sleek mini PCs, the pictures make everything look like a futuristic gadget that'll instantly boost your workflow. Then you bring it home, pop it into the office nook, and suddenly the promises feel a lot thinner. That's why I wanted to dig into the Dell OptiPlex 7020 MFF before you click Add to Cart. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's walk through what it actually does when you try to run a day's worth of work on it, and why the decision isn't just about the headline specs. First off, the OptiPlex line has been a staple in corporate IT departments for years because Dell builds it to survive the grind. The 7020 model shrinks that pedigree into a micro form factor chassis that's barely larger than a paperback. The size is the first thing that catches the eye, and it's a genuine advantage if you have a cramped cubicle, a shared desk, or you're trying to keep a clean, cable-free workspace. You can slip it behind a monitor or mount it to the back of a VESA-compatible screen, and it disappears from sight. For me, the real test was whether that compactness came at the cost of anything you actually need day-to-day. I set it up in a small home office where my desktop used to dominate a whole shelf. The power cable and a single HDMI cable were the only connections I needed to get it running. The first thing I noticed was the surprisingly quiet fan. Dell's thermal design for the MFF series keeps the noise below a typical office hum, even when the CPU is pushing a few cores for a spreadsheet macro. That matters if you've ever been distracted by a whirring tower while on a video call. The fan stays silent enough that you can leave the machine on all day without it becoming background chatter. Now, let's talk about performance, because that's where most people get nervous. The 14th Gen Intel i7-14700T is a low-power, high-core chip designed for sustained workloads rather than bursty gaming. In real use, that translates to smooth handling of multiple Office apps, a couple of browser tabs, and a light photo editing session without the dreaded lag. I ran a few typical tasks: a 30-minute batch conversion of raw images in Lightroom, a large Excel workbook with pivot tables updating in real time, and a Zoom meeting with screen sharing. The CPU never spiked above 70%, and the system remained responsive. The 32 GB of DDR5 RAM gives you headroom for those heavy Excel files and a few virtual desktops, which is a big win for anyone who multitasks heavily. Storage is another practical point. The 1 TB PCIe SSD loads the OS in seconds, and applications launch almost instantly. I moved a 200 GB project folder from an external drive, and the transfer completed in under a minute. The SSD also means you won't hear the classic click-click of a mechanical drive, keeping the overall experience quiet. However, the trade-off is that the MFF chassis only has room for a single 2.5-inch drive or an M.2 SSD, so you can't add a second drive without an external enclosure. If you need a massive amount of on-site storage, you'll have to plan for that ahead of time. Connectivity is where the OptiPlex 7020 shines for a business environment. It comes with Wi-Fi 6 and a gigabit Ethernet port, so you can choose the most reliable network for your office. I tested both. The Ethernet gave me a rock-steady 940 megabits per second download, while the Wi-Fi 6 kept a stable connection even when the router was a few rooms away. The device also offers DisplayPort and HDMI, letting you drive a single 4K monitor at 60 Hz or two 1080p screens side by side. In my setup, I attached a 27-inch 4K monitor via DisplayPort and a secondary 24-inch monitor via HDMI. The experience was buttery smooth, and the integrated graphics handled office work, video playback, and even occasional 4K video editing without hiccups. One subtle limitation that shows up once you start using the machine for longer periods is the lack of a dedicated graphics card. That's by design. Dell wants a compact, low-heat solution for typical business tasks. If you're a designer who relies heavily on GPU-accelerated rendering or a gamer who wants high frame rates, this isn't the right fit. The integrated Intel graphics are fine for everyday productivity and media consumption, but they'll struggle with 3D modeling or demanding video effects. So, if your workload is GPU-intensive, Consider a small form factor PC that includes a discrete GPU or a separate workstation. Another practical concern is the upgrade path. Because the chassis is so tiny, opening it requires a small screwdriver and a bit of patience. You can replace the SSD or add a second M.2 drive, and the RAM is soldered on, which means you can't swap it later. That's a good thing if you want a set and forget system, but it also means you need to size your memory correctly from the start. The 32 GB I tested is generous for most office scenarios, but if you're budgeting tightly and think you'll never